I just paused the credits on Blind Fury. Crooked Miami cop, Woody Watson.
Woody Watson.
One of the least heralded DC characters of all time.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Are they in the proper approach pattern for today?
Negative.
Hold the weapon! Now! Charge the lightning field.
Smarter than a locomotive. Stronger than a speeding bullet. Able to leap small children in a single bound. Today we're going to talk about The Curse of Superman.
Dun dun dun.
It's a thing.
It's all that pink kryptonite.
I'm sure you have heard of The Curse of Superman.
No, please do tell. No, I'm aware.
Don't patronize me.
Can I patronize you?
No, I have no wares to sell. Yes, there is an infamous curse around the mostly on-screen role of Superman. Not exclusively, but mostly. And there's a lot of urban legend behind it. There's some really crazy myth behind it, and some really scandalous unsolved mysteries behind it, and also some pretty mundane bullshit. But it is something that is pervasive, and most actors in Hollywood know about. And it actually does affect a lot of decisions being made in casting and even auditioning for the role of Superman. This is one that some of our audience might know about, but there is deeper threads going throughout this that I think are really fascinating and worth looking into, because most people don't connect all the dots. So I tried to do some deep dive research and figure out these spidering threads of, is it coincidence? Is it curse? Is it a mummy's curse? That's one I haven't looked into too deeply yet. But
could it be Mumra's curse?
It could be Mumra's curse, yes. The Superman of Third Earth was not a pleasant fellow. So, those of you who don't know, there's this long-standing thing in Hollywood that there is a curse around the role of the live-action, on-screen representation of Superman, where actors are in one way or another cursed after taking the role. And it is, depending on how you feel about curses, it may or may not be a thing. This curse is frequently associated with George Reeves, who for a long time was the most famous Superman before Christopher Reeve, with no S. So they're not related. So let's keep that in mind. George Reeves starred in Adventures of Superman on TV from 1952 to 1958. And his death is a thing of conjecture and deep-rooted Hollywood mythos. But we'll get into that in a second. First, the Superman curse really started with creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who, of course, premiered Superman in his current form. Originally, Superman was a villain in a lot of their early treatments, because they're both Jewish, and it was a commentary on the Ubermensch, obviously. And in their early versions of it, he was white and bald and fascist, but I think they saw a different avenue to take when they decided that instead of leaning into the Nazi Aryan ideal, they saw an opportunity to sort of make a secular representation of their faith, making Superman a savior figure who, like Moses, was put in a reed basket and sent down the river and then, adopted by a different culture and then...
Never heard of it.
No, I don't know what you're talking about. So when that hit, and it was a huge smash hit concept, they ran with it. Actually, Comics #1 came out, of course, in June 1938, for those of you who don't know. This was a big couple years for comic books. The two found a really influential way to promote their ideals of social equality, social justice. Superman was originally conceived to fight against corruption, injustices of the world. The metaphors are heavy and latent, but successful and extremely popular. And as much as Christians try to adopt Superman as Jesus, it just doesn't wash. And I wish people would stop trying to do that, Zack Snyder.
Oh, it's not like he wouldn't understand.
Bryan Singer did the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, he totally gets Batman. He totally gets Superman.
Totally gets Batman, yeah. Totally get that. Oh, we're going to talk about Zack Snyder, too. But unfortunately, just ask Jack Kirby or Bill Finger or, any number of comic creators. There wasn't really fair or equitable compensation or even respect for their work for Jack Kirby. Jesus Christ. Remember that one story where he went to a printing department over at Marvel and he found some of his original full-page drawings propped up in the ceiling to cover up the holes that were leaking?
Jesus.
I'm like, oh my God. It's like using a Fabergé egg to plug the draft in the wall.
But just put it anywhere.
Put that anywhere, yeah. It's ridiculous. So, the two obviously were not fairly compensated for the royalties of the invention of Clark Kent, Superman, the whole genre, essentially. And they are obviously the first ones struck by the curse because, they invented the fucking thing. Siegel and Shuster were the writer and artist. They ended up selling the rights to their character to DC Comics for $130.
Whoa.
That's inside Llewyn Davis territory right there. And then, of course, immediately after they sold the rights, the superhero became one of the most popular pop culture icons in the world, raking money in obscene amounts. They, unfortunately, because they no longer had rights, couldn't get any, any sort of residuals or anything. So they made no money. I mean, maybe they paid rent for a couple of months, but that's about it. And then they tried desperately later on to recover ownership of the character or even just a share from the profits, but DC wouldn't budge. They lived near poverty almost their entire lives, and as Superman became a billion-dollar franchise. Joe Shuster suffered from really debilitating medical problems. Jerry Siegel became super bitter about Superman in general. In 1975, he was quoted as saying, "I can't look at a Superman comic book. It makes me physically ill. I love Superman, and yet, to me, he's become an alien thing." But he is alien. Anyway, by the 1950s, Shuster's deteriorating eyesight forced him out of artwork in general. He would eventually become nearly completely blind. And so then he started working as a delivery man to earn a living, which also was difficult, because of the blindness. Jerry Siegel did continue to work for DC. I don't know, sold out or bought in, depending on how you look at it. But he had no creative control over his stuff. And he eventually was fired in 1966 after DC found out that he was planning to launch another lawsuit to try and reclaim Superman. In 1975, Siegel and Shuster launched a publicity campaign protesting DC's treatment of their contribution because of the horrible negative press that subsequently came from that. And right on the precipice of Superman the movie, Warner Brothers reinstated their original Superman limited comic strips in their publications, then acquiesced to giving them a lifetime pension of $20,000 a year plus health benefits. Which, I mean, cool, a little too late, but at least positive came out of that. But then, unfortunately, the first issue back on the shelves was Superman Volume 1, number 302 in August 1976. They were able to survive, but never saw the full benefits of their work. Shuster died in 1992 and Siegel in 1996. But they weren't the only early victims of this supposed curse. I think one of the most iconic versions of Superman was the Max Fleischer cartoons of the 1940s. These inspired, of course, Bruce Timm and Paul Dini for the aesthetic of Batman the Animated Series, arguably the best version of Batman ever on screen. But unfortunately, Max and Dave Fleischer, who were the showrunners of the series of cartoons for Paramount between 41 and 43, didn't really have a great time with it either. They had a huge falling out. Cutting ties with each other completely, even though those cartoons were a huge success and have staying power to this day. Go to a dollar store, you can find the complete collection of Max Fleischer cartoons, except for Japo Tours, for good reason. I'm going to say that. Don't bother with that one. really, honestly, genuinely great stuff. And we could get into that some other time because there's a whole episode we could do on those cartoons. Max, despite inventing Betty Boop and producing all of the Popeye cartoons, died penniless. And this was after a huge career in animation. After Superman, he only produced 5 more projects. Even the other people tied to the Max Fleischer cartoons found themselves cursed. The series from 41 to 43 was voiced by a man named Bud Collyer. He had a successful career in game shows. He did some voiceover stuff. He came back in 1966 for a CBS cartoon about Superman. But that is what seems to have really hexed him, because only 3 years after voicing Superman, he had a heart issue and died unexpectedly at the age of 61. Which may be coincidental, but these things start to add up. Now, Kirk Allen was TV's first Superman. He found some really big success as Superman, in these years, but then was completely typecast afterward. He never again had a substantial role, even though he had been a huge Broadway actor before that. He played the character in the 40s in a lot of the Republic-type serials, but couldn't find work after that. He was trapped in the franchise, in the stigma, until the year 1981, where he played, and this is really sad, quote, Pa Kent, for a few seconds in the parody Superb-Man, the other movie. Yeah.
You gotta make a living.
Exactly. And in the interim, he struggled to find work. He was relegated to small voice actor roles and uncredited screen roles. Though granted, he did play Lois Lane's father in 1978's Superman, but I don't think he even had a line. He then ended up dying of Alzheimer's in 1999 in complete obscurity. In 1988, he did an interview with the AP where he said, quote, "I couldn't get another job." And that one's really sad. Just from those examples, you're like, okay, well, there's a couple of actors who just didn't get roles. But this is a common thread. Now, the aforementioned George Reeves, who played Superman in the 1951 film Superman and the Mole Men. I don't know why they crossed over with Marvel then, but that's a stupid joke. And later, the TV series Adventures of Superman. He's the one that's most associated with this infamous curse. After he played Superman, he had a couple of roles. He starred in From Here to Eternity.
It's a classic.
It is a classic, but early test audiences pushed back on his role because they expressed their distaste for seeing Superman at war. And so he had a really hard time shaking off the role. I remember seeing him in, there's an I Love Lucy episode where he shows up as Superman. That's kind of where he was relegated for the rest of his career. Supposedly this plunged him into a really deep depression, and his acting career just basically stalled out. To the point where he had legitimately considered as a career change moving into professional wrestling. And that's interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Especially wrestling in the 40s and 50s. But the weird thing about George Reeves, oh boy, we're going to have to come back to that later. He had affairs. There were a lot of scandals behind his alleged extramarital stuff. But he was engaged and set to be married. But just days before, he was found dead in his home. And it was ruled a suicide, though no fingerprints were found on the gun that killed him. And yeah, and it's become one of the most fascinating unsolved mysteries in all of Hollywood lore. It was eventually portrayed by Ben Affleck in, is it Hollywoodland? Is that movie? Because it's weird that he played both Superman and Batman.
Yeah, it's Hollywoodland. That's right. From 2006.
Wow, that came out the same year as Superman Returns?
Yeah, and this one had Diane Lane as well.
Whoa! That's incredible, actually. I remember as a kid, there was briefly an urban legend for a while that he had gone mad during the course of his depressive episodes and had jumped out of a window to his death, claiming that he could fly, which was absolute bullshit. It's just some whatever playground gossip that went around. But his death is shrouded in mystery to this day, and I don't know that it'll ever actually be solved. Now, we'll get into some of the people in between the most famous versions of Superman in a little bit, because there are a lot. Some of it is voice acting. But If you skip ahead to the next most famous, and probably still today, the most famous representation of Superman is, of course, Christopher Reeve, who started playing Superman in 1978, all the way to 1987 with Canon Films' Superman The Quest for Peace, which is a rough one. But he, unfortunately, he was a good actor. I know he was a very well-renowned actor and took his craft very seriously, even with Superman. But he was a relatively no-name actor, and so a perfect casting for Superman, especially if you look at the other people who auditioned for that role those years. Was it like Robert Redford and Burt Reynolds, and some have even screen tested for it. And Reeves, essentially a Hollywood unknown, nailed it, and they knew it from the get-go. He's great. Unfortunately, not only did he have a hard time finding substantial roles after playing Superman, which include, I don't know, the really misguided Children of the Damned or Village of the Damned remake with John Carpenter and Tales from the Crypt episode that is okay. He really didn't do a whole lot, but he was a lifelong lover of equestrianism, and that ended up unfortunately becoming his downfall because in 1995 he was thrown from his horse and severed his spine. He was paralyzed from the neck down. And, I mean, he was a quadriplegic. It was one of the most devastating spinal injuries you can have. But he's a strong dude. He's the Man of Steel. So, though wheelchair-bound, he became an activist and philanthropist and a public-facing figure for the rights of the disabled and raised a lot of money for research into spinal injuries, became a huge proponent of, the American Disabilities Act. And all around, how did you do all this great stuff considering this tragedy? And he actually even went back to the Superman universe when he appeared in an arc of Smallville. Mm-hmm. But sadly, and this is where it gets cursorier, more of a curse, he started suffering from an infection in 2004 and started taking antibiotics. However, he had a negative reaction to the antibiotics, and essentially his body rejected them, and as a result, he suffered a heart attack and died on October 10th, 2004. He was only 52. And then his wife, who was also an activist, she was also an actress and singer, but then later a big activist, she died of lung cancer, though she had never smoked, which is a terrible tragedy. And I mean, there are no Kennedys, but I mean, it feels like a fucking curse at that point. So, not to be outdone with tangential curses, in Superman the movie, there was an infant named Lee Quigley who played the infant Clark Kent found in the Matrix pod by, well, no, not the kid that played the toddler, but the one that was put in the pod by Jor-El and Lara. He ended up dying at 14, and I had to dig deep about this because I understand they're being respectful, but almost everybody just put he died of solvent abuse, and I was like, I don't know what that means. Did he drink the dip from Roger Rabbit? Or I mean, I don't really understand what you're saying. And so I finally dug deeper into his story, and
oh yeah.
Yeah, so after the movie, his life kind of really sucked. Apparently, his home life was awful and suffered from bullying constantly. And in 1991, literally died of doing whippets.
Yep.
Which I have never heard of. Totally buy it. Never heard of it. But that means you're doing too many whippets. Let's be perfectly honest.
Doing a lot of whippets. Or like you're moving up past normal whippets to something else.
To something bigger.
Puffing butane or propane or
those cartridges from Pinewood Derby cars sometimes, like that kind of thing.
That is solvent abuse.
And then, of course, Christopher Reeve's co-star, Margot Kidder, man, oh man, did she have a gnarly time. One of these articles I looked into was really poorly researched and very poorly cobbled together, but it starts out by saying Margot Kidder fought with the director of the Superman movies, so her part was minimized later installments. Okay, which director?
The director that memorized her.
I know. It's like, okay, look. Famously, Richard Donner was fired halfway through the production of Superman and Superman 2 because they were filmed back-to-back and replaced by Richard Lester. So which of them did she fight with? I don't know. It didn't say. However, knowing her pattern of behavior and erratic sort of mental states, it could have been both. I would venture to say it's probably Richard Lester because of the sudden change of tone and direction of the entire franchise when Donner was fired. And then, of course, she was unable to find any other major roles. I mean, she did a few movies, but not a whole lot. And then in 1990, she was in a car accident that left her temporarily paralyzed. She couldn't work. She suffered from severe mood swings and depression. I'm sure she had manic episodes and then had a complete psychotic break in 1996. At the time, she had become convinced that her previous husband was trying to kill her and began sleeping outside and then would be missing for days. She was eventually found by police in a paranoid and delusional state and sent to the UCLA Medical Center for treatment. She was there diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She became an activist for mental health research and then did eventually recover enough to appear in an episode of Smallville as well. She then unfortunately died on May 13th, 2018 in Livingston, Montana after a drug and alcohol overdose. The saddest part was that her death was also ruled a suicide. So it literally could have been like, I chugged a bottle of pills, washed it down with some malt liquor, and then...
Does it have to be malt liquor?
No, it's just the first thing I thought of.
Oh, okay.
She seems like more like a whiskey girl. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm imagining her with a bottle of Valium and Mad Dog 2020.
OE. When she was alive, she was actually asked about the supposed curse around the Superman character, and in 2002 was not having it. She said, quote, "That is all newspaper-created rubbish. The idea cracks me up. What about the luck of Superman? When my car crashed this August, if I hadn't hit a telegraph pole..." Who calls it a telegraph pole? "After rolling 3 times, I would have been dropped down a 50 to 60-foot ravine. Why don't people focus on that?" I don't know what she's saying. We can sort of extrapolate what she's trying to say. And it turns out that later on it came out that during her nervous breakdown in 96, when they found her sleeping outside, which is kind of worse than Robert Downey Jr., honestly, quote, "beaten, hair hacked off, teeth damaged, and in a deeply distressed state, convinced that her first husband was trying to kill her. And during this period, she had attempted to fake her own death and get away from her ex-husband. Now we're getting to like Highlander Raven territory. And she'd been living on the streets. She, though, did make a recovery for a while and it claimed before her death to not have a manic episode until since 2007. But unfortunately, we know that there was a lot of stuff that wasn't being addressed. Now, this might seem tangential because you could talk about this in a lot of other, and you know what, a movie we should probably talk about tangentially with The Island of Dr. Moreau. But Marlon Brando, who played Jor-El in the 78 Donner film, died 3 months before Christopher Reeve after a horrific run of tragedies in his own family. Brando's son Christian spent 5 years in prison for murdering his half-sister Cheyenne's boyfriend. And a month after her boyfriend's death, Cheyenne gave birth to their child only to lose custody of the infant because of increasingly erratic behavior and schizophrenia. She committed suicide in 1995 at the age of 25. And that's when Brando started really flipping out. Cheyenne's boyfriend, by the way, whose name was Dag Drolet. That's not a person's name.
I think in Mad Max it is, but I don't know.
That's a new one. Apparently, Christian had murdered Dag Drolet after Cheyenne had claimed that he was physically abusive. Christian pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was in prison for 5 years. And in an interview with The Times, Christian said that later revelations about Cheyenne's mental health made him question whether she was telling him the truth, and he may have murdered an innocent man. So during that trial, Brando admitted in court to failing his son and daughter. Cheyenne would, of course, go on to accuse Brando of abuse, and she started deteriorating rapidly and also suffered from drug addiction leading up to her suicide. So Brando just went up into his shell and spent the rest of his life basically in seclusion. And we can get more into how crazy that is if we talk about The Island of Dr. Moreau. Also, tangentially, Richard Pryor in Superman 3 battled drug addiction his entire life and was famously subject of self-immolation when he tried to light a crack pipe. He actually goes on to make a stand-up routine about, which is genuinely very funny, though it's extremely dark. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's dark as fuck, but he was able to cope with it through his comedy. And a lot of people, even before online message boards and trolls, equate his bad luck, including his eventual multiple sclerosis diagnosis, as related to the curse. This is where we're starting to get into the weeds a little bit. For a while, the curse seems to have faded in some people's eyes, but I mean, a lot of them are not, I don't know. There are people who look more closely at it because the curse very specifically was dark and really impactful, but later on, the curse seemed manifest as bad luck more than it was human tragedy. And so there were some weird incidences that fit into it. Like, for instance, 64-year-old Man of Steel producer Lloyd Phillips passed away of a heart attack 5 months before the movie came out. Kate Bosworth, of course, who played Lois Lane in Superman Returns, publicly attributed her breakup with Orlando Bloom on the Superman curse. That's bizarre, but fascinating. And then later on, 3 people who worked on the DVD of Superman Returns were horribly injured during their work on the release. One was mugged and beaten, one fell through a glass window, and the third fell downstairs. All in the same time period, which is weird.
Yeah.
These are things that have touched sort of the periphery, but still are attributed with the curse. Muriel Hemingway, who played a pointless character in Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, on July 2nd, 1996, Muriel found her sister Margot dead of an overdose. That overdose was ruled officially a suicide by her husband, but Muriel didn't believe it and maintains to this day that she was murdered. That's bizarre. But then you have things like Mark Pillow, for instance, who's the actor who played the Nuclear Man in Superman 4: Quest for Peace.
Fantastic nails.
It's a dumb idea. It's a dumb MacGuffin. But I did kind of like the idea that they got DNA from Superman by clipping a strand of his hair that was holding up like a giant, like 500-pound weight or whatever from a museum. That was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, okay, all right. But then what they did was throw it into the sun or whatever. And you got a guy with a costume and a mullet. Oh, I wish I knew it was that simple.
That's science, Skip.
That does sound like science.
Get with the program.
Sounds like Matthew Broderick's science right there. Or not Matthew Broderick. What's his name? From 2.5 Men.
I don't know.
Lex Luthor's nephew was in that movie. One who was like obsessed with drumming because he was a cool 80s kid.
Ducky?
Yeah, Ducky. John... Because he comes back to play Lex Luthor in the Arrowverse.
Yeah, no, it's just Ducky. Don't reference him by his slave name.
His Christian name is John Ducky.
John Ducky.
King of the Wild Frontier. That's stupid. So Mark Pillow, that was his acting debut. And never acted again.
Nice.
Nailed it. Similar career arcs befell actors John Hames Newton and Gerard Christopher, and also Stacey Heideck, who played Superboy, which is something we should talk about, in the TV series Superboy between 1988 and 1992. Basically, none of them really did any work ever again. I mean, they did some, but not really.
Which isn't that crazy. I mean, in the realm of this topic you're covering, it's, that happens.
That makes sense. And if there is any actual validity to the curse, I believe that it's that it's just, you kind of get typecast.
Yeah.
And I think that's valid. And I think I don't know if it's even specifically about the role itself or the fact that sometimes they go for unknowns to get cast in these giant tentpole roles. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And then you're just always going to be remembered for that. I mean, James Bond had a similar problem, you know?
Mm-hmm. Or like Rey from the Star Wars. Like, she literally has had trouble getting roles since.
Hell, anybody who plays Batman, you have to be somebody already established. And we can talk about that later, too, because there are a lot of people who turn down the roles of Superman and Batman because of the typecasting and the pigeonholing of playing those characters.
Yeah, do you sacrifice what could be huge instant success, but maybe typecasting after that? Or do you go out on your own, but never get the big screen, or I guess even small screen notoriety and recognition?
Mm-hmm. Which I think transitions directly and appropriately into Brandon Routh. He had done some soap opera work. Brandon Routh, who attended the University of Iowa, by the way.
Yeah.
That's a shout out for you more than it is me. He was a relative no-name, but was cast infamously in a really fascinating talent search for Bryan Singer's Superman Returns. And that one is really complicated because it really, really seems obvious that he was cast mostly for his slight resemblance to Christopher Reeve than a reimagining of a new Superman. Because, and you know what? I like Brandon Routh. I root for the guy. I love him in Scott Pilgrim. I don't think he's an actor with a lot of range.
Well, let's be honest. That's kind of a Superman archetype, really, acting-wise.
Yeah, I don't know. Christopher Reeve was a good actor.
One out of...
Yeah, I know. Well, we haven't talked about Henry Cavill yet, so... But, so, I mean, Brandon Routh was one of those guys where he was cast as an unknown, and they do that because you don't have all that pressure of then somebody seeing Superman on screen and then being like, oh, that's a guy playing Superman. They want you to see Superman, which is why Christopher Reeve was so effective. But unfortunately, casting a guy that looked like Christopher Reeve was completely ass backwards, and I think honestly doomed his career, on top of the fact that Superman Returns was considered a flop, considering it was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time, and did make money, but not near justified what they thought, and the reviews weren't spectacular. So those two factors kind of led to Brandon Routh kind of being relegated to obscurity to a certain extent. I mean, he tried to stay in the genre, and good for him, the Bruce Campbell approach. He played in Dylan Dog, a comic book, a terrible movie.
Yep.
But, you know, I applaud him for going for something obscure. Good for you. It just sucked. And then, of course, he goes on to play in Scott Pilgrim, which he's great in, honestly. I mean, for what he is. Then, of course, reprises, well, then becomes the Atom in the Arrowverse, that show. What was that show called? The Doctor Who DC show.
The Challengers of the Unknown? That wasn't it, was it?
No, but I mean, that's kind of what they were trying to do. It was like something of tomorrow.
Yes.
Pedophiles of Tomorrow. I don't know fucking know. Whatever
man.
It's called. No, I don't know. What is it called? It was called the...
Who cares? How about that?
He was in one of those Arrowverse spinoffs as the Atom, and then hilariously, and honestly, kind of satisfyingly, what John Cryer, that was his name.
Good Lord.
God. You have no idea how awful an ADHD brain is. He later actually went on to reprise his role as Superman, the actual Superman character from Superman Returns in the Arrowverse Crisis on Infinite Earths story arc. So he was playing literally two superheroes in the same series. And good for him. He stuck to it. Tom Welling had the same problem from Smallville. He couldn't really get anything going after that. And I think that is the most common manifestation of what we call this curse. Some weird other outliers that people try to connect these things to, and sure, for the sake of argument, let's just entertain them. But, for instance, the wrestler Lex Luger, who, of course, named himself after Lex Luthor. He appeared in... Wait, what? I'm gonna have to look this up. I've never heard of this. New Superboy in 2007. What the fuck is that?
The Adventures of Superboy.
A movie?
No, it looks to be it's season 3. It's an episode. The episode's title is The New Superboy.
Oh, okay, but is it
It's The
animated?
Adventures of Superboy, the early 90s?
Well, here it says 2007. That can't be right.
No, it is not that.
No. Okay, so he was in that Superboy show. Okay, that's fine. Whatever. But which means I guarantee he appeared in it because he is a lifelong Superman fan. And apparently a total asshole. Apparently right after that, or at least soon after that, suffered nerve damage and then ended up being paralyzed. So, okay.
I don't think he's fully paralyzed anymore, but maybe...
No, I think he's rehabbed a
effects.
bit. Is he still alive? I thought he died.
No, Lex Luger's still around.
Okay, all right.
Well, I think so. I
don't know.
By the time this episode comes out, who knows?
That's a good point. So anyway, then of course the great character actor Lane Smith, who was in... Which Pauly Shore movie is it? Son-in-Law. He played Perry White in Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, and not too long after that was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, and then ended up dying in 2005. I don't know. And this is a stretch, but I saw somebody where they attributed Jeff Loeb's son dying of cancer. And I'm like, no. Don't do that. We hate Jeff Loeb, but come on. That's really disrespectful and completely unnecessary. Yeah, how many things has he written? Is it The Curse of Ruining the Ultimates? I mean, come on now. It's stupid.
And he also wrote some good things. He
wrote some great things. But his last half of his career was fucking terrible.
Let's just say, like, if he's not with Tim Sale, there's rarely do I want to see it.
Absolutely. Especially if it was like Mike Rowingo or like Ed McGuinness or like, don't. And of course, then you had guys like, of course, Dean Cain from Lois and Clark: New Adventures of Superman, who also had a hard time finding work until Sci-Fi Originals, essentially. And apparently now it totally always has work. But I mean, obviously his career didn't really go anywhere. Not like, what's her name, who played Lois in that. I mean, but a lot of that probably has more to do with him being a right-wing asshole than it does anything else. It's like Kevin Sorbo thinking he's being blackballed, and it's like, no, you're just Kevin Sorbo. You did one of the God's Not Dead movies, and you're real proud of it. It's just, it's not that you were in Superman, It's because you're kind of a dick.
Well, it's one of those things like, oh, they're canceling me. Well, no, it's because you said the N-word, and no one wants to work with you or or give you money to do things.
Exactly, yeah.
You can say anything you want, but that doesn't free you from repercussions.
Right, yeah, it's a dumb mindset. It's like when Elon Musk took over Twitter and he had like a meeting with all the programmers and everything, and he was like talking shadow bans and things like that. And he did a presentation where he showed regular, what he considered a liberal post or whatever, and how much engagement it got. And then he showed everybody a post that he had done, and it had like 1/10 of the engagement. And he's just like, what is this about? See, this is absolutely biased. And then one of the programmers just goes, well, no, nobody liked your post. So then he fired him on the spot. I mean, that's the kind of mindset we're dealing with there. It's like, oh, it's Hollywood's biased, says Tim Allen, James Woods, Kevin Sorbo.
They can't all have the Superman curse, right?
Right. I don't think Kelsey Grammer suffers from the Superman curse. So that kind of puts a big hole in the myth of it. Also putting a hole in the myth of it, but even more serious and sinister, Allison Mack from Smallville. Woo!
Yeah, well, Kristen Crook is also a part of that as well.
Well, she got out.
She did. Yes.
And I wonder if she like flipped on him, honestly.
I don't know. I don't know. Think she probably just stayed away from the whole thing.
Well, she was involved.
We should probably tell people, yes, that's what you were referencing.
Yeah, she played, of course, Allison Mack played Chloe Sullivan. So if you don't know who any of this is, think of Smallville, instead of Lois Lane, it was about Lana Lang. And so Chloe Sullivan was Lana's Lana. She played the other woman. After the show, she became heavily involved in the sex cult NXIVM, which started out as one of those self-improvement cults by one of the new age sort of like Sam Bankman-Fried type supposed effective altruism idiots, and ended up just becoming a literal sex cult where women were forced into sexual slavery and physically branded with his initials. And she was the top recruiter and executed a lot of the crazy bullshit that went on there. She was about to go to trial, but then eventually pled. Correction. There is no such word as pled. The word is pleaded, and I knew that, and I wear that as a crown of shame. Guilty to charges of racketeering. Yeah, okay, curse? I think, and maybe you could say that she got involved with something like that because she couldn't find work after being typecast in something like Smallville. Sure, you could make that argument. But I don't think there's a direct Superman curse that made her become involved with a sex cult. That doesn't wash.
Well, we're getting very... If you're involved in Superman, it spreads through people making the DVDs to...
Right, I know. And granted, there's a lot of weird coincidence involved in all of that. But the only reason I bring those things up is because it's part of the lore. It's like that urban legend, how weird it was that all those people that witnessed the JFK assassination ended up being killed in mysterious ways. And I'm like, yeah, but there were like 30,000 people who were there at the JFK assassination. Like, statistically, that's just going to happen, you know? And it's more of an examination of how those kinds of urban legends and myths sort of manifest and linger, permeate, even though they really don't necessarily have anything to do with anything. And of course, in that vein, we'd be also sadly remiss if we didn't mention Zack Snyder and the suicide of his daughter Autumn, which obviously has nothing to do with the curse, but it's like the actual Kennedy curse. Oh, that family's cursed because obviously the horrible tragedies that did happen, but then also Carolyn Kennedy, which they did to her. Nobody else did that to her. Or like the pedophile one that ended up dying because he was skiing and ran into a tree. You know, like, yeah, it's a curse in the fact that you have a family that had all the money in the world. So, yeah, sometimes they're going to die in weird ways. Like JFK Jr., that was his fault. He just wasn't qualified enough as a pilot to recover from the incident he had. Like, it's not a curse in that no magical fairies hexed anybody. It's just that the situation and the circumstances around the environment and the gestalt of the whole Hollywood thing, or in that case, the political thing, are more likely to lead you into either failure or absurd behaviors that end up costing you your life or your career, You could say the same thing about, because they fired Zack Snyder from his whole Superman/Justice League arc, and they replaced it with Joss Whedon, who then, of course, eventually was canceled. And he was canceled because he was a fucking creep. Same thing with Bryan Singer. Bryan Singer was fired from Bohemian Rhapsody because he was a fucking pedophile and rapist. Same thing with fucking
Kevin Spacey.
That's not a curse. He's a fucking asshole. I don't know, like Ashton Kutcher once said that he turned down the role of the unmade J.J. Abrams Superman film, Superman Flyby, because the curse would leave him typecasted and then unable to find future roles. Josh Hartnett said the same thing because he also was one of the finalists for Superman Returns and also Batman Begins. Let's not forget that, the year before. Quote, I didn't want to be labeled as Superman for the rest of my career, which he also said about the Batman role. Those are instances of the curse as a thing affecting their careers, not their careers were affected and everyone thinks it's a curse. This was because of the legend of the curse. Legends of Tomorrow. That's what that show is called.
It's almost like a Tulpa-esque thing where like so many people start believing and giving psychic energy to it that it kind of manifests into reality.
Absolutely. I think it is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. And there are other examples of that. But, looking into it, I'm like, I tried to look for a lot of obscure Superman actors, even ones that had failed careers after portraying Superman in one form or another. Like, for instance, Jeff East, who's actually a Missourian, as it turns out, but it's St. Louis, so... He played...
Beggars and choosers and whatnot.
Right, yeah. Well, he played young Superman in 78 Superman, the one that, ran alongside the train and kicked the football to Neptune or whatever it was. He played Huck Finn in Tom Sawyer in 1973, and then he was in Pumpkinhead. He was obviously in Superman, and then famously, of course, The Last Starfighter. But he was just a bit actor. It's not a curse. He's just a guy, even though his IMDb is very funny. All it says is born October 27th, 1957, St. Louis, Missouri, USA. Nickname, Bull. Height, 6 foot. Mini bio. Jeff East was born in St. Louis, Missouri, blah, blah, blah. He's an actor and writer known for Superman, Pumpkinhead, and Tom Sawyer. He's been married to Pascal Lambert since October 23rd, 2015. And then it goes down to trivia. His interests were football and golf. He made commercials as a youngster.
So solid interest.
So anyways, and we can go down the list of guys that played Superman one way or another. And maybe some of the curse is that we don't remember them, like the fact that they played Superman tangentially. But look at how many people did just fine, like Tim Daly, who played the voice of Superman during Justice League and his Adventures of Superman. Tons of people have played Superman and had great careers and great lives. Unfortunately, some of the most famous ones had really bad luck. So I don't think it's a curse, but just like Henry Cavill, he's just kind of an asshole and people don't want to work with him. That's it. It's worth talking about at least. So that is the curse of Superman. So feel free to do some more deep dives into it. And maybe we'll come back if we find out any more information about what happens to Henry Cavill and David Cornsweet later on. We have no idea what's going to happen there. We'll see.
That we will.
That is it, ladies and gentlemen. So, Jake, what would you like to say?
We hope that this hasn't been a curse listening to us, and that we hope you come back for the next episode, and the one after that, and the one after that. Or if you don't like it, just move along. But if you do like it, maybe like, share, subscribe. Please give to your friends, family, relatives, and dudes on the street. If you find a baby in a basket or in a spaceship, give them the podcast. They might like it.
Pick them up.
Pick them up. And if you wouldn't mind rating us 5 big gulps on whatever podcast app that you subscribe to.
I wrote down a quote from you that I want to turn into a non sequitur, completely out of context t-shirt that just says, "Do not tip Dean Cain."
I don't remember saying that at all.
That's why it's really funny.
Huh. Yeah. No, that is good advice. that remains.
Sage wisdom. Right, well, that's it?
Not spare change
Do
or
not.
any
Nope.
2-for-1 Subway coupon. Nothing.
Not even on Venmo. Not even when he busses your table.
No tip. No tip.
Just the tip? No tip. And with that, we'd like to say, please make sure you have paid your tabs. Make sure you cleaned up after yourselves to some sort of reasonable degree. Make sure you support your local comic shops and retailers. And from Dispatch Ajax, we would like to say, maybe see as well on YouTube, because we're going to be launching a YouTube show. Transition. Godspeed, fair wizards.
Up, up, and away.
Leave small children in a single bound.
Well,
Truth, justice, or the American way.
way too many pedos in this conversation to bring kids involved.
Oh, God, maybe that's the Superman curse. Oof. It's rough.
No liking.
Nope.
Please, go away.